Thank you. Yes, my background is Russian philology, which is nowadays become language-based area studies. Philology is a nice name, but it's disappeared. I'm also an expert in Russian literature, which nowadays means that I cover all of Russian culture. So today I will talk about nostalgia. So nostalgia, why should we single that out as an important concept for the humanities? After all, we all know what it is. I think we can agree that the word indicates a sentimental, maybe even melancholic longing for a time past, a place past, or a past condition. And I'm sure that we all nurture some nostalgias, and that this Christmas just passed will have involved some negotiations of different nostalgias in families around the world. And if we look at the etymology of the word nostalgia, nostos means a return home, and algia means a pain or a suffering. So nostalgia is really homesickness, to say the least, in a very simple way. Sorry, I need to get my glasses up here. The word's history reveals that it was coined already in 1688 by a Swiss doctor attempting to diagnose the sad mood of immigrants desiring to return to their native land. That is, this homesickness. And more than being sad, the afflicted patients could become obsessed with this longing and consequently lose touch with the present, become incapacitated, and even confuse real and imaginary events. They could hear voices and see ghosts. Luckily, the disease could be cured back then with leeches, with opium, and not least with a trip back to the motherland. Gradually, however, nostalgia became an incurable disease, a characteristic of the modern age. For the Romantic poets and philosophers of the 19th century, nostalgia was a sign of sensibility, and longing for an original home was central to Romantic nationalism and useful for nation builders in search of historic roots. Later, during the progression and modernization of the 20th century, nostalgia became less praised, and itself seemed to change into a longing for being at home in the world at all. So, we sort of all know what nostalgia is, yet there are important lessons to be learned from humanities scholars who have identified and analysed nostalgia as a specific cultural phenomenon with certain characteristics and consequences. Svetlana Boym is one of the most prominent nostalgia scholars. The typology and analysis presented in her book, Nostalgia of the Future, from 2001, continue to inspire and have become a must for any investigation of nostalgia, also when they are criticized and amended. Boym, here's her book. Boym was born in Leningrad in 1959, studied in the Soviet Union and in the US. She immigrated in '81, and she became a Harvard professor of comparative and Russian literature. She died already in 2015, fortunately. She's an early example of what is no longer unusual. That is, a scholar combining Russian or East European expertise and experience with Anglo-Western experience and approaches. And this can also be seen in the Nostalgia book. She writes about the general concept, general cultures of nostalgia in Europe, but her focus is predominantly on post-communist examples and on Russia. Boym's motivation was to understand the contemporary nostalgia boom, which she saw as a boom, a symptom of our age, probably caused by globalization processes in general, and in Eastern Europe intensified because of the radical system changes and their consequences. And this is an important point when we teach in East European studies. Remember that the system changes in Eastern Europe coincided with all these globalization processes. So they had a double kind of radical change. We know nostalgia, we know Yugo-nostalgia, some of the reactions in Eastern Europe. The possible functions of nostalgia in Boym's view are partly that they are a yearning for local collective memory, a defense mechanism in hectic modern life, or a handing over of personal responsibility. According to Boehm, nostalgia has creative potentials, but also potential dangers, not least the danger of ideological, political exploitation. And we must face the riddles and puzzles of nostalgia in order not to become the next victim or victimizer. So Boehm's definition of the concept and the new typology that she suggests, my PowerPoint, is to actually name two basic types of nostalgia. The first type is restorative nostalgia, and this is her definition. It attempts a reconstruction of the lost home, so it stresses the nostos and not the algia. It thinks of itself as truth and tradition. It protects the absolute truth, and it loves symbols. So it will reconstruct monuments, restore and invent tradition. It's characteristic of national memory in many states, and as we have just seen from Rubina's talk. In this restorative nostalgia, we see two main plots. The return to origins, we must now come back home to our true origins, and the conspiracy plot. We are surrounded by enemies, we must protect ourselves against them. So here is one type of nostalgia. The other type is reflective nostalgia. It thrives in the longing, the algia, in the pain and suffering of the lost home. It's thoughtful, ironic, or desperate sometimes, but it dwells on the ambivalences of longing and loves to linger on ruins. I'll come back to that. It actually calls absolute truth into doubt, and it's potentially an ethical and creative challenge. It loves details rather than symbols. And it is not so characteristic of national memory, but more of social memory, of which we have just heard Mette talk. So, even if you don't get all the points of Boehm here, because she also writes in a very essayistic, very impressionistic way, you can see that there is a good nostalgia and a bad nostalgia. I think that's clear to everyone. So restorative nostalgia is bad. Reflective nostalgia is good. This concept has then been used by a lot of scholars, and they have been quick to say we cannot just use these two very basic. We need more distinctions and more precision. And I just want to mention one of the scholars involved here, Maria Todorova, also writing mostly on Eastern Europe in her book Post-Communist Nostalgia. So her aim is to apply more precision to the concept of nostalgia. She says we need to look for who is actually speaking or performing nostalgia, in which spheres and genres is nostalgia expressed, what does it express, and she says, well, restorative and reflective is not good enough. Maybe restorative should actually be subdivided into restorationist, the people who actually want to restore, or restorative in the meaning of curative, so you keep, you protect, and then the reflective. So we actually have three types in play here. And I will now show you some examples. Oh, I forgot to look at the time, but you will tell me. Yeah, okay, good, because... Okay, I have a lot of examples from contemporary Russia, and now I'll go through them very quickly, but I'll just ask each of you to think that, okay, by whom is it performed, in which spheres, and which kind of nostalgia? And please remember that Putin is not behind everything. That's one point. I'd be happy if you take that with you today. So, in the 1990s, the nostalgia boom in Russia was for the pre-revolutionary past. So they got rid of the Soviet Union, the Soviet symbols out, the statues. You all remember the statues being taken down, but the pre-revolutionary past was where they wanted to go. So you see, they got the old coat of arms with the eagle. We have a huge statue of Peter the Great here. It's actually from Moscow. They resurrected in the middle here the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. It was built originally in 1812, then it was pulled down in 1937, and now it was resurrected as a true copy of the old model. A lot of protest, actually. Here in the right... left corner, you see Ganina Yama, which is outside of Yekaterinburg, where the place where they believe the last Tsar family was killed. They have erected a whole Disneyland of Orthodox churches. It actually looks very much like a Disneyland, with one small Orthodox church for each of the victims from the Tsar's family. You see a renaming of streets, getting them back to the pre-revolutionary names of streets or buildings, and of course you all know Leningrad, going back to the name of St. Petersburg. So getting rid of the Soviet part of history and going back to the pre-revolutionary. You also see use of the old alphabet. If any of you know Cyrillic, you can see that the letter on this bottle of vodka is actually an extinct letter in the Russian alphabet, but it is then pulled back into existence, and yat, it's just a sound, but it's used to symbolize, of course, this is a good old vodka from before Soviet Union destroyed everything. And you see people playing with this tendency to use old letters in the top right corner here, where you can also see Viagra spelled with using old letters. And this was very, very predominant. You still see all of these kinds of symbols. So the pre-revolutionary past still plays a big role. You see it in films also, the pre-revolutionary past, most famously by the films by Nikita Mikhalkov, who's also the leader of the Russian Film Society. They get a lot of funding from the state, and he has a patriotic program to make patriotic films, which he himself does. Huge films. He always plays the main role himself. And here you see him as the good Tsar, Alexander III, to the left here, from back when time was fantastic. It is a 3.5-hour-long film exploiting every prejudice you have about Russia. You'll see here all the traditions, beers, vodka, playing, whatever, and they are confronted with the bad Americans who come to Russia just to exploit their birch woods. So The Barber of Siberia is an opera. Our hero, the Russian hero, sings in this opera. He's honest, he's good, he's naive, he has values. For the Americans, The Barber of Siberia is a huge machine built to cut down all the birch trees to make money out of them. And of course they lie and they steal and they do everything for money. But also just to say, you also have parodies of this, looking for a national identity in the pre-revolutionary past. The peculiarities of Russian hunt, where you have a Finn going to learn about the Russian hunting traditions from the 19th century. And he dreams about it. That's from the opening sequence in the top right corner. And then when he arrives, it turns out that national hunting in Russia is actually a vodka drinking party, where even the bear gets drunk, sorry. So that's a parody of nostalgic national identity. Then when, I'm trying not to use the word Putin, that is my, from the 2000s, we see a revival of the Soviet past, so a nostalgia for the Soviet past arise. And people begin to post online, but also to collect items from the past, from the Soviet past. And you see again, well, of course, for tourists, they have always been there, you know, but now also young people wearing T-shirts with Lenin and Stalin on them. My native country is the USSR. We have a new national anthem in 2001, where they actually went back to the Soviet anthem, because it was cancelled, the Soviet anthem, and for some years it was very embarrassing when the Russians won medals in international games. They didn't have a song to sing. They had a melody, but they didn't have a song. And then they went back. It's the old melody. It is da-da-da-da-da, you know it, the Soviet melody, but now with new words, praising the big empire, the great Russian Empire instead. We have the red star back in the symbols for the army of the Russian Federation. And we also see people, of course, buying this stuff. It is difficult to say, always to say, is this nostalgia? I should have said it from the beginning. Is it just kitsch? And sometimes it's even art. This soc-art is the post-Soviet version of pop art. You see where they play with Mickey and Minnie here, if you remember the original. So sometimes it's art, sometimes it's kitsch, sometimes they're playing with it. Some like to linger on the ruins of the old statues here, perhaps. So it's not necessarily restorative nostalgia. Mikhalkov goes on to follow the regime, the lead of the regime, so he has also gone back to look at the Soviet times. And maybe some of you know the praised film Burned by the Sun from 1994, where he played the main role, of course, and he was a victim of Stalin and died in that film. Now he's erected his hero, Kutov, because he had to go and help win the Second World War in this Burned by the Sun too. So we have the Second World War again, Stalin as the leader of the country back during the Second World War. And one important point here, talking about different nostalgias, is that how do they actually combine a nostalgia for the pre-revolutionary Russia with the nostalgia for Soviet times? It's a big question. And we saw the problem for the millennium of the 1917 revolution. There were almost no celebrations. There were no celebrations in Russia, because how could you actually celebrate a revolution that destroyed a lot of the things that you now praise? However, in normal daily life, they actually managed to praise, to look back to both, to have a nostalgia for both, because it's a nostalgia for the great empire, for the strong leader, and then for the church, the right faith, the Orthodox faith, which has somehow always been there, and then they kind of forget that it was crushed in Soviet time. So you see some mixtures of this Orthodox priest also walking in the Victory Day parade for the Second World War. Yes. Oh, and here is an ironic comment on the mixture of these pasts. So Lenin and Jesus walking with Mickey Mouse between them. There's been some... time's running out. It's 5 minutes.
5 minutes and then question.
And then question. Oh, good. I thought you said 5 minutes before. I'll just breathe. Okay. And have some water. It seems that, I mean, you can always go back into history, and now lately they have gone all the way back to 988 with this film, The Viking. In 988, Russia was christened, baptized with Vladimir, under Vladimir in Kiev Rus, so in the old, smaller kingdom of Rus. And this new film from last year, no, 2016, shows a barbaric people with this Viking walking in front and actually becoming civilized and taking over the Christian faith and baptizing his country, thus turning Russia into this civilization and this great empire that it is today. And this is the point of this film, Viking. And it should be said that the namesake, the presidential namesake, actually did visit the film set and doesn't mind any comparison with the main actor in this, or the main role in this film. So civilizing Russia and being the great leader in front is, yeah, what's the point here? So there's been some critique, of course, and also this back to the future. So Russia is moving forward into the history, into its history, actually, into some kind of medieval state. Vladimir Sorokin, one of the leading writers, has written this Day of the Oprichnik already in 2006, where he predicted this going back to medieval times and actually very cruel conditions for the normal people in Russia. As you have seen, there are many kinds of nostalgia. I hope I showed you also with the ironic comments and so on. So it's not just state nostalgia, but you also do have a lot of state nostalgia, and indeed the bad kind of nostalgia, the restorative nostalgia, is very prominent in the Russian regime today. So monuments are being raised, and buildings of this former glory are being built. So this is an example of nostalgia used or abused to political purposes to help the present government to stay in power by nurturing these images of a strong empire led by a strong leader and built on true faith, true Orthodox faith. But of course, nostalgia may also be exploited by political parties in democratic societies and democratic states. And in fact, I think that few political parties are totally free of nostalgia, but they have different pasts to long for. And I think, well, in Denmark, some parties only long for the past before certain other annoying political parties were born. Yes, others long for the time before globalization. And of course, nostalgia may also be exploited by NGOs and interest groups and trendsetters, and basically anyone who has something to sell, playing on these feelings. Stone Age diet is one example, actually. So these were my examples. Sorry for this confusion. I thought I had lesser time, so I speed it up. Maybe I didn't explain all the examples. But for the end, I would like to just take a look at ourselves here today and say that can the concept of nostalgia then help us reflect on what we do in humanities, to reflect on humanities as such? So when we criticize the development within humanities, are we actually nurturing a nostalgia? I actually think we are, but it's not necessarily the bad kind. So with Boehm and Todorov, we can tell our critics that we do not want to restore the good old days because we know that they never existed. And we don't aim to reconstruct these mythical ivory towers. Maybe some of us do tend to keep some artifacts. I keep a lot of old books and dictionaries and university curriculum. You know, people are throwing out books everywhere now. Our universities are discarding libraries in Denmark. So I keep these books, and we still like to consult and reflect upon these old artifacts. But in doing so, I believe we linger on the ruins much in the way historians do, or archaeologists do. So we actually do it to learn about, to remember what we already know and shouldn't forget, and also to have something to build our future activities upon. And even if we are nostalgic, I believe that ours is a reflective nostalgia with great creative potential. So politicians who are not here should be aware of this, and if they should wish to exploit this particular nostalgia, I wouldn't mind, for one. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tine. I think you used up all the time, but there is one question here.
Marianne, I was wondering why you did not bring second-hand time by Svetlana Alexeyevna into this. Is that because it's too reflective compared to the examples you showed, or what?
Yes. No? No? I mean, do you know I translated that book into Danish, actually, so yeah. I know it very well. Why I didn't bring it in? No, exactly. It shows all the different kinds of nostalgias. Some of the witnesses in Alexeyevich's book want to return to the past. They long for it. Others say, yes, we lost something, but still we can't go back and we shouldn't go back. So what was your point in bringing it in? So I think it also has all these kinds of different nostalgias.
Yeah, how you yourself probably fit it in this picture.
Yeah, but do you agree that it has all, because...
I agree that it has so many reflections that it covers the whole thing. Yeah.
Exactly. So it has, yes, Gorbachev was a hero, but he was also the one who destroyed everything. And Stalin was terrible, but he was also the one who helped us win the Second World War, so on. So all of this is there, but there are 400 different nostalgias there. So.
Thank you very much, Tine Roesen. Thank you.